There is so much to talk about in the gospel this week on this momentous day that there isn't time to talk about it all. But as I read this text, one sentence struck me over and over. When Pilate, in astonishment, turns to the Sanhedrin council who have brought Jesus to him on trumped-up charges and asks, "Shall I crucify your king?" The response is not a yes, and it certainly isn't a no. Instead, they insist to him, "We have no king but the emperor." Now, what makes this so troubling is that these men are telling the unfiltered truth. They really do have no king but the emperor. Their king is one who has conquered them and oppressed them, threatened their culture and threatened their lives. And they have not only accepted this leader, they have embraced him. It seems utterly irrational. But we've had foreshadowing of this very thing in some of the parables of Jesus. Earlier this year, the lectionary gave us the story of the prodigal son, the son who takes every scrap of the family treasure he believes he's entitled to and spends it on himself, in despite of his family, his culture, and even his religion. When the Sanhedrin council and their allies proclaim their fealty to the emperor, they do the same thing, because the emperor isn't just a king. No, by this point in imperial Roman history, that is, after the Battle of Actium, when Octavian gained his decisive victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the ruler of the empire is not a bureaucrat, but a divinity. On the monument celebrating his victory at Actium, Octavian, who becomes Caesar Augustus, names himself both king and God. So when the Sanhedrin council declares him to be their only king, by default, they also declare him to be their God. How could this happen? It happens because, under Caesar's rule, they've actually done fairly well. And they are tending to generalize how well they're doing to the rest of the population, a move that those who have much tend to do unthinkingly to those who have little or nothing. And so any shifting of allegiance makes them very afraid. They have a lot to lose. If we go back a bit in the Gospel of John to chapter 11, we can see this in something important that happens directly after Jesus brings Lazarus back from the dead. The Sanhedrin council meets, and John boils their discussion down to this. Here, they say, here's this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up. "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die than for the people than that the whole nation perish." Now, for reasons that are not clear to me, John offers a gloss on these words of Caiaphas. He suggests that the high priest did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. And that sounds lovely until we get to the next sentence. So, from that day on, they plotted to take his life. Whatever the murkiness of the motivation John introduces here, the fact is that the council were desperately afraid of losing something that they had because they were cooperating, collaborating, and colluding with the Roman authorities. They might describe their fear, as they do here, as being rooted in concern for the community's continued existence. And there is some justification for this. Anyone who proclaimed himself or who was proclaimed king technically challenged the emperor's authority. But from the conversation between Jesus and Pilate in John's Gospel, which we read today, we find that Jesus is absolutely uninterested in challenging Roman authority, something that the Sanhedrin council must have known. Yes, Jesus has an entirely different project in mind. And if we've read Jesus' teaching with anything resembling attention, we know what that project is. Protecting the weak, sharing the wealth, extending friendship to the stranger. These concepts definitely challenge and threaten those whose comfort, security, and privilege relies on a system of domination and oppression, where the comforts of the few rely on the misery of the many. This is the situation any group that colludes with an oppressive regime finds itself in, and thus the Sanhedrin Council found itself challenged. And indeed, these are revolutionary concepts. And in a sense, widely adopted, they pull down empires because they don't permit power to accumulate in the hands of a few. But given the past 2,000 years, I think we have to concur that the wide adoption of them has not been completely successful. We have not been successful. I have not been successful. Why not? Because our culture, kind of like the Sanhedrin, is generally and genuinely afraid. It's afraid that if we hold all property and resources in common, we'll be communists. It's afraid that if we extend our friendship to the stranger, then immigration will run amok and there will be no jobs for those who were born here. It is, or until very recently has been, afraid that if we extend the right to marry to all who love and are ready to commit to a marriage relationship, actually, I have no idea what we're afraid of on that one. That one's never made any sense to me, but obviously a lot of people are afraid of that kind of change. But here's something else. Our culture is afraid that if we take seriously, really seriously, the need to abandon carbon-based fuels, that as someone who obviously hadn't thought about it too hard put it, will go back to living in caves and eating dirt. I'm not sure we ever did that, so I'm not sure it's something we can go back to. But as opponents to the Green New Deal in the US would have us think, maybe we'll have to stop having children and no one will be allowed to own a cow. So the bigger the fear, the less sensible the reactionary rhetoric is. And the desire to preserve privilege for the few can and often does deny justice and equity to the very, very many, both those around us and those who come after us. And to return to the Sanhedrin Council, their fear must have been very grave indeed, because in John's story, they respond to it by abandoning their God in favor of a divine emperor. So I read that line over and over again, in shock, not only at what the Sanhedrin Council had done, but how it directly mirrors what we do over and over again. In fear, we make all kinds of arguments against exactly the sorts of changes that would bring us closer to the kingdom of God. And in our worst moments, we make decisions that actually abandon all that Jesus has taught us in fear that it might just cost us something, which, if we currently hold more than our fair share of God's inheritance, is obviously true. But I don't want to leave the story there, because that's not how the story of God's mercy ends. There is always grace. There is always a way forward. There is always a path to the kingdom of God. So in this text, I looked for alternatives. Who, in this story, refuses to accept the emperor as king? Who, in the end, recognizes the relationship and rulership of our God and the prime ministerial function of Jesus? The obvious answer is Nicodemus. If you remember him, he's the one who visits Jesus in the dead of night to try to understand. The one who later at least has the courage to speak out during Jesus' kangaroo court trial by the Sanhedrin before they take him to Pilate. As one of them, he questions the process, saying, "Our law does not judge people without first giving them a hearing to find out what they are doing. Does it?" Nicodemus, who is flawed and frightened of what Jesus represents and what the consequences might be, has been, to say the very least, not overtly and vocally supportive of Jesus, but at this point, he does something extraordinary. After Jesus has died, he brings 75 pounds of aloes and spices to anoint the body. In current monetary terms, that's about $100,000 worth of goods. This is a burial fit for a king. It couldn't have gone unnoticed. Jesus' death has effectively outed Nicodemus. So for Nicodemus, one of the temple elite, this was a huge risk. So he must have seen the rewards of following Jesus. But there are others as well. Who else is risking everything that the Sanhedrin refuses to risk? Who are those who are acknowledging Jesus as king? Standing near the cross, says John, are his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. I'm not sure if that's 3 women or 4, actually. Along with the disciple, John says, that Jesus loved. Without regard for their own safety, these few who have supported Jesus throughout his ministry have come to witness his death. They are his entourage, his attendants, and all that are left of his court. And as they bear witness and stubbornly refuse to leave despite the potential consequences, Jesus encourages them in an action that permeates the last few chapters of John, where Jesus over and over commands his disciples to love one another. He tells his mother and this one man who has shown up, and it's curious, I think, here that all the women are named. One man is not, for once. He tells them that they are now family. Why? Because a woman without some male relative, which is likely going to be Mary's situation when Jesus dies, is not just economically, but physically vulnerable. So he says to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he says to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, says the gospel, the disciple took her into his own home, regardless of the fact that the disciple is not a blood relative, does not owe Mary any allegiance, for no other reason than for love. For love of Jesus, for love of his message, and perhaps for love of the woman who gave Jesus birth. This is what it means to have no ruler but God, to do things that may be costly, but that love demands we do. It doesn't mean an armed rebellion to overthrow anything. It doesn't mean absolutely uprooting the entire status quo and insisting that everyone else do the same so that we can institute another political system that may or may not be just as oppressive as the one we already have. The revolution is inside of us, every one of us. If we accept God as our ruler and accept the governance of Jesus and his teachings, if we are willing to accept and abide by the rule of love, then it will be costly. It may cost us privilege, and it may cost us status. It may cost us money. It may even cost us relationships. But in the end, we will have justice. We will have peace. We will have equality. We will have joy. And more abundantly than any of these, we will have love. Welcome to the revolution. Amen.
That's really good.